April 1945.
Germany is collapsing. General George S.N.
Patton's Third Army is punching east faster than almost any force in the history of mechanized warfare. And behind the roaring engines of Sherman tanks, a much quieter, much stranger war is unfolding in the farmhouses, barns,
and refugee columns of the crumbling Reich. Men who once wore the black uniform of the SS,
who once carried the warrant cards of the Gestapo, who once sent thousands to their deaths with a signature or a nod. These men are burning their papers, stripping off their insignia, and pulling on the muddy boots and threadbare coats of farmers, laborers, and refugees. They believe that if they can simply disappear into the chaos of the collapsing front, they can vanish,
wait out the occupation, re-emerge later, perhaps to fight again in the shadows. They believed American soldiers young, exhausted, thousands of miles from home would be too soft,
too rushed, too eager to keep moving forward to notice a calloused-looking farmer with slightly too clean hands,
or a civilian with a strange red scar under his left arm. They were wrong.
And the men who proved them wrong weren't infantrymen or tank crews.
They were investigators, interrogators, a small,
secretive branch of the US Army that most people have never heard of, the Counter-Intelligence Corps. This is the story of how Patton's
CIC agents tore the disguises
off some of the most dangerous men in the collapsing Third Reich,
and what happened when the lies finally ran out.
If you love deep, detailed World War II history like this, make sure you're subscribed to WW2 History Trench. We'll come back to that at the end.
For now, let's go back to the spring of 1945. April 1945.
The Third Reich that had once dominated Europe from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow was disintegrating with terrifying speed. Allied armies were crossing the Rhine.
Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east. German cities lay in ruins from years of strategic bombing, and the vast administrative apparatus of the Nazi state, its ministries, its police forces, its intelligence services, was collapsing along with the front lines that had once protected it. For the ordinary German soldier, defeat meant the prospect of becoming a prisoner of war, a grim but survivable fate under the terms of international law, at least when captured by American or British forces rather than the Soviets, whose treatment of German prisoners
reflected the brutal reciprocity of a war fought
with far greater savagery in the East, but for a very different category of men, the officers and functionaries of the Gestapo,
the Sicherheitsdienst, and the SS,
particularly those who had served in occupied territories, in concentration camps,
or in the machinery of racial persecution and mass killing. Defeat meant something far more dangerous. It meant capture, interrogation, and quite possibly a war crimes trial and a hangman's noose. These were men who had built careers, in some cases entire identities, around the exercise of absolute and often murderous power. Now, with that power evaporating by the day,
many of them turned to the only strategy that seemed to offer any hope of survival: disappearance. As the front collapsed, a quiet, informal, and remarkably widespread practice took hold among members of the Nazi security apparatus.
Uniforms were discarded in ditches and burned in farmhouse stoves. SS paybooks, Gestapo warrant discs, and Nazi party membership cards were destroyed or buried.
Insignia was ripped from collars.
Men who had spent years in positions of feared authority suddenly needed to look as ordinary, as harmless, and as forgettable as possible. The disguises varied.
Some posed as displaced persons, claiming to be refugees fleeing the fighting, mixing into the enormous columns of civilians clogging the roads of central Germany in those final weeks. Others posed as farmers or agricultural laborers, betting that American troops, focused on advancing and securing military objectives,
would have neither the time nor the inclination to closely scrutinize every civilian encountered along the way. Still others acquired, through theft, forgery, or simple opportunism, the identity papers of soldiers who had been killed or ordinary civilians who had no connection to the Nazi security apparatus at all, hoping to blend permanently into a new, invented past. This wasn't merely a matter of individual panic. There was, in fact, an organized dimension to this disappearance effort.
Senior SS leadership, anticipating defeat well before the final collapse,
had discussed and in some cases actively planned for the possibility of a post-war underground resistance movement, an effort that came to be associated with the name werewolf,
intended to carry out sabotage, assassination, and guerrilla resistance against occupying Allied forces after the formal surrender.
Whether or not any individual fleeing Gestapo agent was consciously part of this planned resistance, American commanders had every reason to treat the phenomenon of disguised Nazi functionaries as a serious potential threat.
Not merely a matter of post-war justice, the organization tasked with unraveling this vast, improvised deception was the United States Army's Counterintelligence Corps, commonly known by its initials, CIC.
Far less famous than the combat divisions racing across Germany under Patton's command.
The CIC nonetheless played an absolutely critical role in the occupation of Germany, tasked with identifying security threats, rooting out Nazi officials attempting to evade capture, and preventing exactly the kind of post-war insurgency that Werwolf and similar efforts hoped to ignite. CIC agents were a different breed from the young draftees filling out infantry divisions. Many were older, often in their late 20s or 30s, drawn disproportionately from civilian backgrounds in law enforcement, law, journalism, and academia. A significant number spoke fluent German, some as native speakers German Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution in the 1930s and had since become naturalized American citizens,
now returning to the land they had escaped.
This time wearing American uniforms and carrying the authority to interrogate the very kind of men who had once persecuted their families and communities. For these agents in particular, the work of unmasking fleeing Nazi officials carried a weight of personal history that went far beyond ordinary military duty. CIC teams moved just behind the advancing combat units, embedding themselves in newly captured towns and villages,
setting up interrogation points, reviewing identity documents,
and systematically working through the civilian population in search of individuals whose stories didn't add up. Their work was unglamorous, painstaking,
and utterly essential to the broader Allied effort to dismantle the Nazi state not just militarily,
but administratively and ideologically. Unmasking a disguised SS officer or Gestapo agent required more than simple suspicion.
It required a methodical, almost forensic approach to interrogation, one that CIC agents refined constantly as they encountered an ever-widening range of cover stories and disguises. The process typically began with documentation.
Every civilian encountered in a newly occupied area was required to produce identification, and CIC agents became expert at spotting the telltale signs of forged or altered papers, inconsistent typefaces,
mismatched stamps, dates that didn't align with known administrative records,
or simply papers that were suspiciously pristine for a man claiming to have spent years doing hard agricultural labor.
But documents could be forged convincingly enough to fool a cursory glance. So CIC interrogators developed a second layer of scrutiny, the physical examination of the person themselves. A man claiming to have spent years as a farm laborer should, in theory, have the calloused hands, sun-weathered skin, and physical bearing of someone accustomed to hard outdoor work.
Soft, uncallused hands on a man claiming years of manual labor were an immediate red flag. So too was posture. Men who had spent years in military or paramilitary service often retained a distinctive bearing, a habit of standing at something resembling attention that was difficult to fully disguise, even when consciously trying to appear relaxed. And civilian interrogators also relied heavily on simply asking
detailed questions about the claimed cover,
identity, and listening carefully for inconsistencies.
A man claiming to be a farmer from a particular village could be asked detailed questions about local geography,
crop rotations, market days, neighboring families,
or the local parish priest, questions that a genuine long-term resident would answer instinctively and that a fabricated cover story, however well rehearsed, would eventually fail to withstand under sustained,
detailed questioning. Of all the techniques CIC agents developed for unmasking disguised SS personnel,
none is more famous or more chilling in its simplicity than the search for a small tattoo hidden in an unlikely place.
Members of the Waffen SS, the military combat branch of the SS, were, for most of the war, tattooed with their blood type on the inside of the upper left arm, near the armpit.
This practice, intended as a practical medical measure to speed up battlefield transfusions, became one of the single most reliable methods for identifying former SS members attempting to pass themselves off as ordinary soldiers or civilians,
regardless of what story they told or what papers they carried. CIC agents, along with military police, conducting screening at POW collection points and checkpoints throughout occupied Germany,
began systematically checking the underarms of military-age men for this small, distinctive marking.
It's a detail that captures something essential about the entire unmasking effort. For all the sophistication of interrogation technique, forged documents, and psychological pressure, One of the most effective tools available to American investigators was something as simple
and as inescapable as a piece of ink permanently embedded in a man's skin. Some SS men,
aware of this vulnerability, attempted to remove or disguise the tattoo, burning or scarring the site to obscure the mark,
or claiming the resulting scar was the result of a wound or an old injury, but a burned or deliberately scarred patch of skin in precisely the location where the SS blood group tattoo was known to be placed was,
in itself, a glaring red flag to any experienced CIC interrogator.
Often more incriminating than the tattoo itself would have been, since it signaled an obvious, deliberate attempt at concealment. Beyond the SS blood group tattoo,
CIC agents and military interrogators became remarkably attuned to a whole vocabulary of small physical details that could betray a man's true background, regardless of the identity he claimed. Soft hands, as mentioned, were an obvious marker for men claiming manual labor backgrounds, but interrogators looked for other signs as well.
Pale, untanned skin on the wrists and forearms of a man claiming years of outdoor farm work suggested a life spent largely indoors behind a desk,
in an office, in precisely the kind of administrative role that Gestapo and SD officials typically occupied.
Fingernails that were neatly trimmed and clean, rather than broken and stained with the ground in dirt of agricultural work, told a similar story. Even the way a man carried himself while eating, sitting, or standing during a lengthy interrogation session could offer clues. Officers accustomed to a certain standard of authority sometimes struggled to fully suppress ingrained habits of command, speaking with unconscious precision, correcting grammar reflexively, or displaying a kind of controlled, clipped formality strikingly at odds with the rough,
informal manner of a genuine farm laborer or refugee. And then there was simply the matter of physical condition. Years of wartime rationing had left much of the ordinary German civilian population thin, malnourished, and worn down, some fleeing SS and Gestapo officials.
By contrast, particularly those who had held privileged administrative positions with access to better food and living conditions retained a physical robustness that stood out sharply
against the general population around them.
A detail that experienced CIC agents learned to notice almost instinctively during even brief encounters. As American and Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany,
they implemented an increasingly comprehensive system for registering
and screening the civilian population in occupied territory, a bureaucratic dragnet designed specifically to catch exactly the kind of disguised officials the CIC was hunting. Under the Allied occupation framework,
virtually every adult German in occupied territory was eventually required to complete detailed questionnaires commonly known by the German term Fragebogen, covering employment history, party memberships, military service, and organizational affiliations dating back to well before the war.
These questionnaires were cross-checked, wherever possible, against captured German administrative records, membership rolls, and personnel files,
many of which had been seized largely intact as German bureaucratic offices were overrun faster than their staff could destroy the paperwork inside them. This created a powerful, if imperfect, verification system.
A man claiming to have never held any position within the Nazi Party or its affiliated organizations could, in many cases, be checked against captured membership records that told a very different story.
The sheer bureaucratic thoroughness of the Nazi state, its obsession with documentation, record-keeping,
and administrative paper trails ultimately became one of the greatest vulnerabilities of those attempting to erase their own involvement in it.
The same paperwork that had once enabled the machinery of persecution now became a tool for exposing the men who had operated that machinery. In no screening system,
however thorough, could catch every disguised fugitive through documentation and physical examination alone. A significant portion of the CIC's success in unmasking hidden Gestapo and SS personnel came instead from an entirely different source: the German population itself. As the war ended and the full scope of Nazi crimes became increasingly public knowledge, and as ordinary Germans grappled with years of resentment toward the privileged, often brutal treatment they had received at the hands of local party officials, police, and SS personnel, a considerable number of civilians proved willing, sometimes eager, to identify former Nazi officials hiding among refugee populations or attempting to pass as ordinary villagers. Motivations varied enormously.
Some informants acted out of genuine moral conviction, wanting to see perpetrators of atrocities held accountable.
Others were motivated by personal grievances, old scores, or simple opportunism. recognizing that cooperation with American occupation authorities might yield practical benefits in a devastated, resource-scarce post-war landscape.
Whatever the motivation, this flow of information from the local population proved to be one of the CIC's most valuable intelligence assets,
often succeeding where documentary, analysis, and physical examination alone might have
failed. This dynamic reveals something important
about the collapse of the Nazi regime that goes beyond the purely military story of Patton's advance. The social fabric that had once sustained the Third Reich, built on fear, coercion, and complicity, unraveled rapidly once the machinery of terror lost its power to enforce silence. And many ordinary Germans proved far more willing to expose former Nazi officials than those officials had ever anticipated when they discarded their uniforms and pulled on the clothes of farmers and refugees.
The historical record,
though often frustratingly incomplete given the chaotic conditions of the war's final weeks,
preserves numerous accounts of CIC agents successfully unmasking significant Nazi officials attempting to disappear into the general population. In numerous documented instances across the American occupation zone, CIC teams identified concentration camp guards and administrators attempting to pass as ordinary refugees or displaced persons,
using the combination of physical examination, document verification, and detailed interrogation described earlier to strip away carefully constructed cover stories. Some of these men had traveled considerable distances from the camps where they had served, hoping that unfamiliarity with their true background in unfamiliar territory would provide additional cover. In many cases, it did not, as CIC screening procedures were applied with remarkable consistency across the occupation zone. It's important to note, with appropriate historical honesty, that the system was far from perfect. A substantial number of former Nazi officials, including some who had been directly involved in serious crimes, did successfully evade detection in the immediate post-war period,
either slipping through screening entirely or benefiting from the sheer administrative overload facing occupation authorities dealing with millions of displaced persons,
prisoners of war, and civilians simultaneously. Some would later be identified and prosecuted years or even decades afterward, through the painstaking work of dedicated Nazi hunters and war crimes investigators.
Others, tragically, were never brought to justice at all.
The CIC's wartime and immediate post-war unmasking efforts, however impressive in scope, represent only the first chapter of a much longer,
and still not fully complete, historical reckoning. General Patton himself held complicated,
at times controversial views regarding denazification and the treatment of former Nazi officials in the territory his forces occupied, views that put him at odds, on occasion, with broader Allied occupation policy. Patton, whose primary preoccupation remained the swift defeat of German military forces and, later, growing anxiety about the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union,
sometimes expressed frustration with the scope and rigor of denazification procedures,
viewing certain aspects of the screening and removal of former Nazi Party members from administrative positions as an obstacle to the practical business of restoring order and functioning government in occupied Bavaria,
where his Third Army was primarily responsible for the occupation administration. This tension reveals an important and often underappreciated
dimension of the story: the effort to unmask and hold accountable fleeing Gestapo and SS personnel was not a universally prioritized undertaking across the entire American command structure.
It depended heavily on the diligence of individual CIC agents and their immediate commanders, operating within a broader occupation bureaucracy that held genuinely mixed and sometimes conflicting views about how aggressively to pursue denazification.
Even as the CIC's own agents, many of them deeply committed to the mission, continued their painstaking work of interrogation and verification, largely independent of these higher-level policy tensions. For the men who were successfully unmasked by CIC screening, stripped of their false identities, confronted with their true service records,
and taken into custody, the path forward varied enormously depending on the severity of their documented crimes and the evidence available against them. Lower-ranking Gestapo and SS personnel, particularly those without direct evidence linking them to specific atrocities,
were often processed through denazification tribunals,
facing penalties ranging from fines and employment restrictions to, in more serious cases, periods of internment in dedicated camps established by occupation authorities, specifically for the detention of automatic arrest categories under Allied policy, a designation that applied broadly to SS members, Gestapo officials, and other categories of personnel deemed to require mandatory detention and review regardless of individual evidence of specific crimes, more senior officials, and those against whom clear evidence of direct participation in war crimes or crimes against humanity could be established, faced the prospect of formal prosecution, either through the major international military tribunal proceedings at Nuremberg or through numerous subsequent trials conducted by American military tribunals and by other Allied and,
eventually, German judicial authorities in the years that followed.
The successful unmasking work of CIC agents in the immediate aftermath of the German collapse formed a critical foundation for many of these later prosecutions,
providing the initial identification and detention of
individuals whose crimes might otherwise have gone entirely
unexamined had they succeeded in permanently vanishing into the post-war chaos. The story of CIC agents unmasking
disguised Gestapo and SS personnel in the spring of 1945 is, on its surface, a story about clever detective work about calloused hands,
hidden tattoos, forged papers, and careful interrogation.
But it carries a deeper significance that extends well beyond its immediate historical moment.
It represents one of the earliest and most consequential efforts at accountability in the aftermath of the Second World War, a recognition,
on the part of American occupation authorities,
that military victory alone would not be sufficient to dismantle the apparatus of Nazi terror, and that a systematic effort to identify and detain the
individuals who had operated that apparatus was essential
to any genuine reckoning with what the regime had done. It also offers a case study in the limits and possibilities of accountability.
In the chaotic aftermath of total war,
the CIC's efforts were resourceful, often remarkably effective given the scale of the challenge, and rooted in a genuine commitment among many individual agents, ensuring that perpetrators of atrocity would not simply disappear into anonymous post-war lives.
At the same time, the effort was imperfect,
constrained by resources, competing priorities,
and the sheer scale of the collapse it was attempting to manage, a reminder that even the most determined pursuit of justice operates within real and often frustrating limits. 8 decades later, the work of the counterintelligence
corps in the final months of the war and the early occupation period remains a relatively obscure chapter of World War II history,
compared to the battlefield exploits of Patton's tank columns or the courtroom drama of Nuremberg.
But it deserves far greater recognition than it typically receives. These were men often overlooked, rarely decorated for battlefield heroism in the traditional sense, who did the patient, unglamorous, occasionally dangerous work of separating truth from an ocean of desperate lies,
at a moment when the stakes of getting it right, or getting it wrong, could not have been higher. Every disguised SS officer who successfully talked his way past a checkpoint was a potential threat left free to disappear into a new identity, or worse, to potentially organize the kind of post-war resistance that Allied commanders genuinely feared in the spring of 1945. Every disguise that was successfully stripped away was, in its own small way, a measure of justice delivered to victims who could never speak for themselves. Lot to understand how difficult the CIC's task actually was.
You have to understand the sheer scale of human movement flooding the roads of Germany in the spring of 1945.
Millions of people were on the move simultaneously, German civilians fleeing the advancing
Red Army in the east, liberated forced laborers and concentration camp survivors from dozens of nations trying to find their way home, released Allied prisoners of war, demobilized German soldiers attempting to reach their families,
and mixed invisibly among all of them the fugitives the CIC was hunting. Some estimates place the total number of displaced persons moving through the collapsing Reich in these final months at well over 10 million people.
An almost incomprehensible tide of humanity clogging every road, rail line,
and river crossing across Central Europe for a CIC team operating in a single town or checkpoint. The challenge was not simply identifying a handful of hidden fugitives, it was doing so while processing an unending stream of exhausted, frightened, often traumatized civilians, any one of whom might be telling the truth, and any one of whom might be lying. Screening could not be conducted with the leisurely thoroughness of a peacetime investigation.
Agents needed techniques that could be applied quickly, under pressure, to enormous numbers of people,
while still catching the small percentage of genuinely dangerous
fugitives hidden among the overwhelming
majority of ordinary civilians simply trying to survive the collapse of their
country. A typical CIC checkpoint operation
in the spring of 1945 followed a fairly consistent pattern.
refined through weeks of trial and error as American forces pushed deeper into German territory. As American units secured a town or crossroads, military police would establish control points along the main roads, funneling civilian traffic through a controlled processing area. Here, basic documentation would be checked by MPs, with anyone lacking proper papers or anyone flagged for any reason nervous behavior. Physical characteristics inconsistent with their claimed identity, informant tips, or simple random selection pulled aside for more detailed screening by CIC personnel. The secondary screening area was typically set up in a requisition building, a town hall, a school, sometimes simply a farmhouse commandeered for the purpose. Here, CIC agents would conduct the more detailed interrogation process, reviewing documents against known forgery indicators, asking detailed questions designed to test the consistency of a claimed identity, and, where circumstances warranted, conducting physical examinations for the SS blood group 2 and other telltale physical signs. Agents kept running lists, sometimes in formal notebooks, sometimes more formal card indexes of known SS and Gestapo personnel, wanted individuals, and characteristic details of common cover stories that had already been unmasked elsewhere, allowing information to flow, however imperfectly, between different CIC teams operating across a wide geographic area. This early, improvised intelligence sharing network became increasingly sophisticated as the occupation progressed, eventually developing into more formalized systems for tracking wanted individuals across the entire American zone. While much of the historical record, understandably, focuses on male SS and Gestapo officials attempting to disguise themselves, women played a significant and often under-examined role on both sides of this hidden conflict. Female members of Nazi organizations, including concentration camp guards from women's camps and female administrative personnel within the Gestapo and SD, also attempted to disappear into the general civilian population, often with a somewhat easier task than their male counterparts, since they lacked the immediately identifiable SS blood group 2 and could more plausibly claim purely domestic or civilian roles throughout the war. CIC agents developed parallel screening techniques for female suspects, relying more heavily on documentary verification, informant testimony, and detailed interrogation regarding wartime employment and residence history. At the same time, women within the German civilian population played a crucial role as informants, sometimes providing CIC agents with detailed information about the true identities and wartime conduct of former neighbors, employers, or local officials attempting to blend into refugee columns or claim newly invented civilian backgrounds. In several documented cases, it was women in local communities, sometimes motivated by direct personal suffering at the hands of the individuals in question, who provided the crucial tip that led to a successful unmasking. As Allied occupation policy solidified through 1945, American authorities established formal categories of individuals subject to automatic arrest and detention, regardless of whether specific evidence of individual wrongdoing had yet been established. This policy dramatically simplified the CIC's task in one important respect. Once an individual's true SS, Gestapo, or senior Nazi party status was established, the question of whether to detain them was no longer a matter of case-by-case judgment, but a straightforward matter of policy. These automatic arrest categories included all members of the Waffen-SS above a certain rank, all Gestapo and SD personnel, senior officials of the Nazi Party and its affiliated organizations, and individuals who had held leadership positions within a wide range of state and party institutions closely associated with the machinery of Nazi rule. This meant that the central task facing CIC agents in the field was often not determining guilt or innocence in a broader moral sense, but simply and definitively establishing a suspect's true wartime identity and organizational affiliation, precisely the task that the combination of physical examination, document analysis, and detailed interrogation was designed to accomplish. Facilities were established specifically to process and detain individuals falling into these categories, including large-scale internment camps capable of holding thousands of detainees while their cases were reviewed, and specialized interrogation centers, among the most famous being the facility that came to be known informally as Dustbin, established to hold and interrogate senior German scientists, industrialists, and officials of particular intelligence interest to the Allies. To bring this process to life, it's worth walking through how a typical unmasking might have unfolded.
drawing on the documented patterns and techniques described in CIC records and post-war accounts from the period. A man arrives at a checkpoint in Bavaria in late April 1945, claiming to be a farm laborer named Hans, displaced from a village further east that has already fallen under Soviet control, making his claimed background difficult to immediately verify. His papers appear largely in order, though an experienced clerk notices the stamp on his identity card is slightly too crisp to uniform, compared to the wear typically visible on documents that have been carried and handled for years, pulled aside for secondary screening. The man is asked routine questions about his claimed village, the name of the local church, the family who ran the nearest mill, the typical planting schedule for the region's principal crops. His answers are hesitant, generalized, lacking the specific, textured detail a genuine long-time resident would produce instinctively. A CIC agent notes his hands, pale, soft, with none of the ingrained calluses or ground in dirt one would expect from years of claimed agricultural labor. Asked to remove his shirt for a basic physical examination, standard procedure by this point in the occupation, a small tattoo is discovered on the inside of his upper left arm, 2 letters and a symbol denoting blood type. In the distinctive small lettering associated with Waffen-SS practice, confronted with this physical evidence, the man's cover story collapses within minutes. Further interrogation, cross-referenced eventually against captured SS personnel records, reveals his true identity. A mid-ranking SS officer who had served in an administrative capacity connected to a concentration camp facility, now attempting to erase that history entirely and begin a new life as an anonymous farm laborer. He is detained under the automatic arrest category applicable to his true rank and organizational affiliation, and his case is forwarded for further investigation regarding his specific wartime conduct. Cases like this one, repeated with variations across hundreds and ultimately thousands of individual encounters throughout the American occupation zone, illustrate the systematic, almost procedural nature of the unmasking process. The CIC developed a process built not on dramatic individual detective brilliance, though that certainly played a role, but on the patient, cumulative application of consistent, well-honed techniques across an enormous number of individual cases beyond the physical and documentary evidence. CIC agents developed considerable skill in the psychological dimensions of interrogation techniques, designed to place pressure on a suspect's carefully rehearsed cover story without resorting to the kind of physical coercion that would have violated both American military policy and the broader moral distinction the Allies were determined to draw between their own conduct and that of the regime they had just defeated. Agents would often conduct repeated interrogations, sometimes separated by hours or days, asking the same background questions in different orders, from different angles, watching for inconsistencies between successive tellings of the same claimed life story. A genuine identity, drawn from lived experience, tends to remain consistent even when questioned repeatedly and unpredictably. A fabricated identity, however carefully rehearsed, frequently reveals more contradictions under this kind of sustained, varied pressure. A different name for a claimed sibling, a shifted date for a claimed event, a detail about local geography that doesn't quite hold together on a second telling. Agents also learn to exploit the psychological toll of the collapse itself. Many fugitives, exhausted, frightened, and increasingly aware that the war was ending in total defeat rather than the negotiated settlement some had once hoped for, were psychologically vulnerable in ways that skilled interrogators could recognize and, within the bounds of permitted practice, use to their advantage, creating conditions where a suspect's composure, carefully maintained through the early stages of an encounter, would eventually crack under the cumulative weight of sustained, methodical questioning. The American CIC did not operate in isolation. British intelligence services, particularly the Field Security Service and later dedicated war crimes investigation units, conducted parallel screening operations in the British occupation zone, developing broadly similar techniques and, importantly, sharing intelligence with their American counterparts regarding wanted individuals who might attempt to cross between occupation zones in hopes of escaping detection in one area by relocating to another. This cross-zone cooperation became increasingly important as it became clear that some fugitives were deliberately attempting to exploit the administrative seams between different Allied occupation zones, hoping that inconsistent record-keeping and communication gaps between American, British, French, and in a very different and far more fraught context, Soviet authorities might provide an avenue for continued evasion, growing coordination among Western
Allied intelligence services throughout 1945 and into 1946 gradually closed many of these gaps. Though the emerging tensions of what would soon become the Cold War introduced new complications, as certain German officials with intelligence value regarding Soviet capabilities began, controversially, to receive more lenient treatment from Western intelligence services eager to recruit their expertise, a morally uncomfortable chapter in the broader story that falls somewhat outside the scope of the CIC's immediate unmasking
work in the spring of 1945.
But one that shaped the longer-term legacy of this period in complicated ways. It's worth pausing to consider the human toll of this hidden conflict from multiple angles.
Because the story of CIC agents unmasking disguised Gestapo officials is ultimately inseparable from the broader human catastrophe of the war's final months. For CIC agents, particularly those of German Jewish background who had personally fled Nazi persecution years earlier, this work carried an intensely personal dimension. Interrogating a man who might have participated, directly or indirectly, in the machinery that had murdered members of one's own family or community was not simply a professional assignment, it was,
for many of these agents, an act of confrontation with the very forces that had shaped the darkest chapter of their own lives.
Post-war accounts and oral histories from CIC veterans of this period frequently describe the profound, complicated emotional weight of this work.
A mixture of grim satisfaction at successful unmaskings and the exhausting psychological toll of sustained exposure to the perpetrators, and sometimes the unrepentant justifications of Nazi atrocity.
For the broader German civilian population caught up in this screening apparatus, the overwhelming majority of whom had no connection to the crimes the CIC was investigating, the experience of checkpoints, interrogations, and suspicion was its own kind of hardship, layered on top of the already immense suffering of a collapsing, defeated nation.
The CIC's work, however necessary and however carefully conducted according to the standards of the time,
existed within this much larger landscape of civilian displacement, hunger, and uncertainty that defined Germany in the spring and summer of 1945, one of the most consequential, if unglamorous,
factors behind the CIC's success was the sheer volume of German administrative records that fell into Allied hands largely intact as the front collapsed. The Nazi state, for all its ideological fanaticism, was also a bureaucracy of staggering scale and thoroughness, generating personnel files,
party membership rolls, promotion records,
and organizational charts documenting the affiliations and career histories of millions of individuals. As American forces overran German government offices,
regional party headquarters, and SS administrative centers,
they frequently found filing cabinets and archive rooms that retreating officials had simply not had time to destroy,
despite standing orders to burn sensitive documents ahead of the advancing Allied armies.
In some cases, panic destruction efforts were only partially successful, leaving charred but still partially legible fragments that trained document analysts could reconstruct or cross-reference against other captured material.
These captured records became an indispensable resource for CIC operations, allowing agents to verify or disprove claimed identities against actual documented service histories.
A man claiming no involvement with the SS could, in a growing number of cases as record collection and cataloguing improved throughout 1945,
be checked directly against captured membership rolls, promotion orders, or unit rosters.
This transformed what might otherwise have been a purely interrogation-based process, reliant on physical cues and psychological pressure, into an increasingly document-driven
verification system, one that grew more powerful and more
comprehensive as Allied archival and
translation teams worked through the enormous volume of
captured material in the months following Germany's surrender. The skills CIC agents applied so effectively
in the field did not emerge spontaneously. They were the product of deliberate training programs developed by US Army intelligence in the years and months leading up to the German collapse, refined continuously as real-world experience revealed which techniques worked and which did not. Prospective CIC agents underwent training that combined instruction in German language and culture, the organizational structure of the Nazi Party and its affiliated security services, interrogation technique, and the practical mechanics of document analysis and forgery detection. Many candidates were selected specifically for backgrounds that suited this kind of investigative work: former police detectives, attorneys, and, as noted earlier, German-speaking majors with first-hand cultural and linguistic fluency that proved invaluable in the field. As the occupation progressed and the CIC's collective experience grew,
this training was continuously updated to reflect emerging patterns, new categories of disguise being attempted, newly identified physical or behavioral tells, updated lists of known forgery techniques being used to produce fraudulent identity papers.
This iterative, evidence-based refinement of technique,
feeding real field experience back into training programs for new agents and refresher instruction for those already deployed,
was a significant factor in the increasing effectiveness of CIC screening operations as 1945 progressed. To fully understand why American commanders treated
the hunt for disguised SS and Gestapo personnel with such urgency, it's essential to appreciate the genuine, if ultimately somewhat overstated,
fear of organized post-war Nazi resistance that pervaded Allied planning in the final months of the war.
Nazi propaganda in the war's closing weeks made repeated,
explicit reference to a planned guerrilla resistance movement,
invoking the folkloric image of the werewolf as a symbol of hidden, vengeful resistance that would supposedly continue the fight from the shadows even after conventional military defeat.
Radio broadcasts called on German civilians to resist occupation through sabotage, assassination of collaborators, and attacks on occupying forces.
Reports, some credible and some wildly exaggerated,
circulated among Allied intelligence services regarding training camps, weapons caches, and stay-behind networks specifically established to support this anticipated insurgency. In practice,
organized werewolf resistance never materialized on anything approaching the scale that had been feared, and most historians today regard it as having achieved only sporadic, limited impact isolated acts of sabotage and a small number of assassinations,
rather than the sustained guerrilla campaign Nazi propaganda had promised.
But American commanders in the spring of 1945 could not have known this in advance,
and the genuine uncertainty about the scale of the threat gave the hunt for disguised SS and Gestapo personnel men who represented exactly the kind of trained,
ideologically committed cadre that could
theoretically staff such a resistance movement, an added layer of urgency that went beyond simple,
retrospective justice and touched directly on immediate American force
protection concerns for all its documented successes.
The CIC's screening apparatus was far from infallible, and an honest accounting of this history requires acknowledging its significant limitations and outright failures. The sheer scale of population movement in 1945 meant that a considerable number of fugitives simply were never subjected to the kind of detailed secondary screening that might have exposed them,
either because they avoided checkpoints entirely,
moved through areas with less intensive CIC coverage,
or simply were fortunate enough not to be flagged for closer examination amid the overwhelming volume of civilians being processed daily. Some historians estimate that a meaningful percentage of mid- and lower-ranking Gestapo and SS personnel successfully evaded any serious screening in the immediate post-war period,
disappearing into ordinary civilian life across occupied Germany and,
in some documented cases, eventually into new lives in South America, the Middle East, and elsewhere, sometimes assisted by clandestine escape networks that emerged in the years following the war's end. Additionally, as noted earlier, emerging Cold War tensions introduced a genuinely troubling complication to the broader accountability effort,
as American and other Western intelligence services began to recognize the potential value of certain
former German intelligence officers and technical
specialists in the context
of the developing confrontation with the Soviet Union.
A number of individuals with documented Nazi-era records received markedly more lenient treatment,
or in some cases active protection and recruitment,
than the CIC's own founding mission of accountability would otherwise have dictated.
This uncomfortable reality does not erase the genuine achievements of CIC agents in the field during 1945,
but it does complicate any simple narrative of complete, unblemished success. The foundational identification and documentation work performed by CIC agents in 1945
cast a long shadow over the decades of war crimes, investigation and prosecution that followed.
Detention records, initial interrogation transcripts, and captured personnel files gathered during this early screening period frequently resurfaced years and even decades later, providing crucial evidentiary foundations for later prosecutions conducted not just by American authorities but by West German courts,
and by the international network of Nazi hunters and investigative journalists who spent the post-war decades tracking down
individuals who had successfully evaded justice in
1945.
the broader institutional knowledge developed by the CIC, the techniques of document verification, the physical and behavioral indicators of concealed identity, the value of systematic cross-referencing against captured administrative records also influenced the development of subsequent American counterintelligence
and war crimes investigation practices in later conflicts,
representing a body of practical, hard-won expertise whose origins trace directly back to those farmhouse interrogation rooms and roadside checkpoints of Bavaria and the wider American occupation zone in the spring and summer of 1945. The summer of 1945.
The disguises had largely failed. The farmers with soft hands, the refugees with suspiciously clean papers,
the quiet men who stood just a little too straight one by one.
The machinery of allied counterintelligence pulled them out of the crowd. Not all of them.
Not every case ended in justice.
But far more than the men who tried to vanish ever expected. It's a story that rarely makes it into the popular narrative of those final days, overshadowed by the drama of tank battles and the fall of Berlin.
But it's every bit as important to understanding how the Third Reich truly ended, not just on the battlefield, but in farmhouse kitchens, at checkpoint tables,
and in quiet rooms where trained investigators asked one more question than a desperate man could safely answer. If you found this story as fascinating as we did digging into it.
That's exactly the kind of history we cover here every week. Hit subscribe to WW2 History Trench so you don't miss the next deep dive into the stories the mainstream war documentaries skip over.
Drop a comment and let us know what part of this story surprised you the most. And we'll see you in the next one.